first episode of the Mind Music Matter podcast, where we talk about all things music related. Our guest today is a friend of mine, Eli Schille-Hudson, who's a guitarist based in Bellingham, Washington, where he heads the guitar studio at Western Washington University. At Western, Eli teaches courses in music theory, guitar history, pedagogy, and fretboard harmony alongside applied lessons on classical guitar. He also conducts and arranges for the WWU Guitar Ensemble. Eli has appeared variously as a recitalist, accompanist, chamber musician, and concerto soloist across the United States. He has adjudicated and given masterclasses in the United States and Canada, and his students have won top prizes in the Northwest Guitar Festival. In addition to teaching and performing, Eli remains active as a composer and songwriter. He completed his education at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music, where he took bachelor's and master's degrees under Maestro Ernesto Bettetti. Please help me welcome my friend, Eli Schille-Hudson. All right. So, Eli, let's start with the heavy questions. How was your day, man?
So far, so good.
So
far, so good.
Let's get into it,
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so you said you were practicing this morning. You're working on some stuff.
Yeah.
What were you working on? Was it stuff for the Villalobos? Did you say Villalobos or Ponce? You said Ponce.
Oh yeah, Ponce. Yeah. I was working on the Ponce Sonata for guitar and harpsichord.
Okay.
So I was working. So it's in 3 movements, and the guitar part is not actually all that crazy challenging. It's really idiomatic.
Okay.
For the most part. There are a couple of small passages that are a little bit less friendly to the hands, but it's certainly not the hardest thing Ponce ever wrote. And it's really gorgeous, but it's kind of funny because like the guitar part by itself, I mean, actually I'd be curious to know what you think about this, Mike, but at least for me, I feel like there are some pieces of chamber music where it's almost like the guitarist's part could be a solo piece. Like it would,
for sure.
It might be a little bit of a strange solo piece, but it would still more or less kind of hold up in kind of carrying the dramatic moment and stuff. This definitely doesn't.
Really?
It feels like one half of a like a phone call. Like you're just hearing like what one person is saying, and you figure there's got to be tons more to this conversation. So even though it's not all that challenging, it kind of feels like wrapping your head around the guitar part is maybe like 10% of the challenge. And ultimately what's really interesting is to hear it in the context, obviously. So but anyway, that was all a very long way around saying that like I'm in the stage of kind of trying to work through some ideas about fingering and trying to have a clear command of like the tunes that are embedded in the piece. So I'm kind of feeling like I'm doing a little bit of kind of nitty-gritty detail fingering work, and then a little bit of like very broad
surface level
bird's eye view kind of work. Conceptual work.
Interesting. Because when you were talking about how some chamber music can kind of stand alone on its own, like each part or one of the parts can kind of definitely like the second movement of the Harlan Weiss concerto. There's a lot of points in that where I feel like that could just almost be a solo, and it is pretty much just a large solo section. For sure. It's making me think of like the Bach inventions too, because the Bach inventions, they're on the piano, but I've also heard a lot of duo recordings, like guitar duo recordings of those as well. And that's interesting because those they're interesting on their own, but if you put them together, then there's so much more going on. So that was an interesting thought.
For sure.
Yeah. So I guess, if you're learning something, like what's the beginning, if you have something like that, that's kind of how long is that piece?
Oh, sorry, say that one more time.
How long is that piece that you're working on, the Ponce?
Oh yeah, so I think it clocked at like around 15-ish minutes, maybe a little bit shorter than that.
Okay. And then you have
Um,
how long to work on it?
yeah, so we basically decided that we were gonna do it, I think at the I think basically like very end of June, and then we're playing it twice in the first week of September. So I guess it's basically about 2 months.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
So yeah, so I guess because to me that's kind of if you got a lot going on, that can be an overwhelming project, depending on
yeah.
the level of difficulty of the piece. Which if it's Ponce, I'm assuming it's at least pretty challenging. So
Mm,
so what's kind of your approach? I guess like when you're first starting, what would be the first thing you would do? Or what
yeah.
are the first things you would do?
Yeah. Well, so I guess it's uh so I guess the answer is different depending on whether or not I'm working on a piece of music that I feel like is already somewhat in my ears,
Hmm.
um, or if I have a kind of listening familiarity with it or not. Um, in this case, I don't feel that I have any real listening familiarity there. I've heard one recording a few times, and that's basically um,
Hmm.
all of my familiarity with the piece. So I
Wow.
feel like the task is um, I feel like there's another layer to the task in this case that wouldn't be there with a more familiar piece of music. So um, I think yeah, I guess the first kind of layer of my approach to learning something like this, especially on a time crunch, is that I feel like I want to be developing that kind of listener's mindset right alongside um, my work on whatever details are gonna ultimately build up to the final performance.
Yeah.
So I find myself going back and forth a lot in my practice between sort of reading parts of my partner's part, um, and then trying to kind of make diagrams for myself about the areas in the form that I need to keep in mind so that I can, feel as though I have a sense of the kind of total dramatic arc of the piece.
Okay.
Like you would get if through repeated listenings,
Sure.
if you were a listener listening to the music. Um, and then I'm finding that I really I guess this has been true not just in Ponce, not just in working on chamber music, but in general. I feel like at least throughout my first few years of playing classical guitar, where I was extremely focused on sort of faithfully rendering the score, um, and kind of trying to wrap my head around whatever technical challenges were inherent in doing that, and blah 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 blah. I found that I didn't really end up feeling like I knew the musical materials in the same kind of like bones deep way that I knew the musical materials of like the songs that I was playing when I was like a teenager.
Interesting.
Where because I feel like there's a kind of interesting phenomenon where like I mean, and maybe it's just interesting to me, maybe I'm overthinking it or something, but like um I feel like, I can be walking down the street and um I hear a little snippet of like a tune from a car going by. And I can hear maybe like three words, and then I can sort of like sing to myself the entire rest of the song, right? If it's something that is sort of back far enough in my memory or whatever, and that I have that kind of familiarity with. But then
Hmm.
all of a sudden, and it could be that I didn't think of that song for years before hearing it randomly just walking down the street. But then, by contrast, I can work for like years on a piece of solo guitar music. And then when I walk on stage, still I'm scared I'm going to have a memory slip. So
Yeah.
I kind of feel like, how can these two things be that, like, you know, on the one hand, there's such an intimate knowledge, you know, with the one kind of stuff, but then it just there's a lack of trust, or some kind of lack of that same relationship with the stuff, you know, primarily with the very music that I'm primarily dealing with in my professional life. So I feel like I ask myself a lot about how I can try to close that gap and make the solo guitar stuff, or the chamber guitar stuff, the classical guitar stuff, kind of be written on my heart in the same way that, you know, the songs that I was playing as a teenager seemed to be. So I find that a lot of times my energy in practice recently has been going to, like, feeling like I really, really know the melodic information that, like the thing that I want the audience to walk out like whistling.
Yeah.
Um, and I find, like, so like in Ponce, there are a couple of themes that are kind of funny. They're very Ponce. They're, because on the one hand, there's a kind of clear tonal logic to them, and they're kind of really well taken care of. They're sort of four square, um, but then they've got all of these interesting little modulations built into them, and these little, like, modal
Hmm.
inflections that, I don't know, kind of give them an air of mystery and make them sound like Ponce to me. But I've been really fascinated in the last couple of days by how those tunes, those little snippets of melody, really can make a full practice session of, like, playing through them in all 12 keys, or
Mm.
singing through them while counting, or singing through them on scale degrees, or whatever. Like, that can be a really satisfying practice session. And at the end, I do feel like I have that kind of understanding, or that kind of intuitive feel for the music that, um, uh, makes me feel closer to it. And I think it feels like it kind of accelerates the process of getting to know it. Um, you know, uh, again, sort of circling back to, like, you know, what do you do when you don't have very long to learn a piece of music? And I feel like part of the answer is, well, what, what do you do when you have a short time to learn a piece of music? Well, you learn it really well, or you employ whatever strategies are going to make absolutely sure that it is written on your heart
Mm.
forever. Um,
Yeah.
and so I don't know, maybe that's kind of a long rambling answer, but I guess, yeah, I've been trying to take that kind of tack, um, so that it feels, I anticipate it on stage sort of feeling as good, or close to as good as, like, you know, banging through chords on a simple song.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot in there.
Hmm.
Uh, I think, well, circling back to what you're talking about kind of at the beginning there, I'm curious what you think. Don't you think, though, some of that, because you're saying that the music that you used to practice when you're younger, or like hearing a song, or whatever that sticks in your brain, like I feel like I'm not sure what type of music you listen to, but pop music, or like a lot of like rock music, is kind of designed to be kind of that way too.
Hmm.
So do you feel, because I remember when I first started going to music school when I was, my freshman year, or sophomore year, a lot of the theoretical concepts I was learning, I would try to learn them in the context of it's like a simple song, like a four chord progression, and try to hear, because to me it was much easier to hear it there than in like a complex like Beethoven symphony or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I was curious about that, because I was wondering if you feel like, are you trying to take the same approach with more complex styles of music, or do you feel like yeah, what exactly do you mean? Um, yeah, what does that mean to you, I guess?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I guess it's like this for me. I feel like, you know, on the one hand, they're like the you know, rock and roll and the folk music and stuff that was and still is really dear to me and sort of my musical personality. Um, it is designed to be memorable, and it is, I think part of the reason that it is so easily memorable for so many people is that it isn't a lot of times the materials are not dressed up in the same way that they are in like some piece of really really meticulously worked out classical music.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe the precise way that the materials are deployed is not quite as complicated to understand, or doesn't take maybe quite so much buy-in,
Sure.
and to comprehend in the same sort of immediate way. Um, but I think what I'm looking for myself is maybe not sort of like reducing the level of complexity down to the level of a rock song, or anything like that. But instead, I'm trying to like recreate the feeling of familiarity and ease,
Mm.
um, of familiarity and ease of connection with the music, and familiarity and ease of recall.
Hmm.
The uh, To find a way to recreate that even in a much more complex musical scenario,
Yeah.
um, to kind of see through it, if that makes sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was also interesting you were talking about melodic information or just learning, studying melodies, and taking that approach. And I think that's really interesting to me. One thing I've been kind of fascinated by recently was I was listening to one melody. I think it was the melody from Dvorak Nine New World Symphony,
Yeah.
the most famous melody. Um, the one it's like da, 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 that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh and I listened to it. Haven't heard that piece in years, and I listened to it the other day, and I realized that within that one melody there's actually a lot of modulations that happen. uh it like modulates because it'll be all diatonic, and then they'll have one note that's outside the key at the very end, and then it'll take that note and modulate to it'll play the same melody but in a new key, and that kind of
Totally.
thing. It was just really interesting because like you were talking about, I think you're talking about the Ponce, with the melody. You're talking about how these little like strands of melodies can go in different directions, and
Totally.
um, that's really interesting, I think.
I agree.
Um, yeah. What do you so you like a lot of that like melodic study is through singing or through you said you take it through all 12 keys. Is that something you do commonly when you're learning a piece, or is that kind of uh more specific for certain types of pieces? Or yeah, I guess that's
Yeah. I try to do that with as many as many things as I can. I think um so I don't think there's ever something. So yeah, when I think about the goal of that kind of practice, um my goal is never um to be able to play an entire piece in all 12 keys from beginning to end. Instead, I think of that transposition work and the work on singing and the work on uh, yeah, actually, I guess I do a few different kinds of things with singing. Um, but I think of that as like a way of think of all of those that family of practice strategies as a way of putting something really small and bite-sized under the microscope,
mm,
so that I'm able to work through it in a really, really thorough way. Um, but I feel that what I get out of that kind of practice um, doesn't really transfer to the scale of a whole piece. Um,
hmm.
it,
Sure.
I guess I also think that a lot of times that kind of practice for me is motivated by the same kind of interest that you were just describing, like with the Dvorak and stuff, you know, of kind of being just basically curious, like how is this music put together? Like
Yeah.
how does it get from the beginning of the phrase to the end?
Right.
You know, what did the composer find interesting enough here to like develop and commit to paper and um, ultimately sign their name to?
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's really interesting. I guess I mean, this is much more aspirational than a concrete outcome of like the practice that I do. But I kind of feel like an ideal thing would be to do that kind of melodic, or well, it doesn't have to be just melodic, but that kind of practice to such a degree that you could walk away like kind of being able to improvise in the style that you were just working with so closely.
Hmm.
And I feel like, one way you can maybe approach that is by um, looking at very, very small pieces of vocabulary in as many different ways and as many different lights as possible. So maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, after persistent enough study of transposition and singing and blah 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 with Ponce, maybe I could like try to improvise a melody in the style of Ponce, or
Yeah,
whatever.
that sounds
Which I feel
tough,
like,
but yeah,
oh my
that's
gosh,
a
yeah, totally,
that's
and
it's a great
absolutely,
goal.
yeah. Well, and I absolutely cannot do it yet. um,
Yeah, for sure.
uh, you know, um,
Trying to improvise a melody that modulates, I feel like that just doing that alone is that's a considerable amount of work right there.
Totally, totally. But I feel like viewing the repertoire that we play and study and spend so many hours on anyway, like as the very thing that is able to teach you that kind of skill. Um, I think that's a at least for me that makes it practicing a lot more interesting because its scope is so much wider
Yeah.
than sort of learning play the piece and play it as nice and um, clean and well taken care of as can be. I mean, that's really interesting too.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I find it somehow more satisfying um, to sort of try to break apart the musical materials and deepen my relationship with them. So I've been trying to do that.
Yeah. And I think that, like you were saying, that doing that type of work really does result in a deeper understanding of the piece and more of it. It's more like embodied within you. You're kind of getting in the composer's mindset and thinking as if you're writing the piece, kind of.
For sure,
Um,
for sure.
and that's what's interesting too. I think we talked about this last time we talked, Eli, but
Yeah.
we're talking about how we spend so much time talking about harmony as musicians and understanding harmony, and it's such a huge part of music. But um, like thinking about like theory classes, I remember we spent so much time talking about like different harmonies, different types of chords, and we talked about melodies somewhat, and we would talk about how melodies would modulate and those types of things and phrase structures and like this is a sentence, this is a period or whatever, that kind
Mhm.
of terminology. But um yeah, I think it would be interesting to talk more about. I still feel like in terms of understanding melodies and dissecting them and kind of understanding how to write a good melody, like that's a I think more time could be spent. It'd be nice to get more maybe it's just me, but I felt like learning more about that would have been really interesting
Yeah.
because right now I'm trying to do work on transcriptions or arrangements, and so a lot of the stuff I'm working on is trying to figure out how to harmonize a melody,
Mm.
and and there's so much you can do if you just have the melody is kind of incomplete, right? Like the harmony underneath it is if there's no harmony and there's only two notes in a measure, then there's a
Yeah.
lot of options you have to harmonize it. And some are sometimes it's obvious and some are straightforward and sometimes um there's a lot of possibilities. So
Mm.
it's interesting to think of just writing a melody. To me, this is what I'm thinking about when I'm hearing you talk about this. Like it's interesting to think of just writing a melody that modulates, or that's just highly chromatic or something like that. And then if you start with that, how if a composer starts there, then how do you harmonize that? Or how are they, like you're saying, like how are they thinking about this melody? How did they come up with this? Um,
Totally.
yeah, that's a hard question, I think, to answer.
For sure, for sure. But I feel like I totally agree. I think that's yeah, I mean the question of how do you harmonize a melody so that's so deceptive. That sounds like such a simple question,
Yeah.
but I feel like that's maybe the most complicated question.
Yeah, because if you give like three people the same melody, they'll have three different, as long as there's some level of like nuance or some kind of complexity. It's not super so straightforward. You'll probably get three different harmonizations, even if it's just small. Like one person makes a chord a dominant seventh chord rather than just a major chord, like even to like those subtleties. But
Yeah.
sometimes that's that level of subtlety. That's what makes that moment better too.
Yeah.
So things like that. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and that's kind of tying into what we're talking about here. And I think that's like the idea of how to write a great melody is really, I mean, I know everybody wonders about that, but that's like I've been thinking about that more recently, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I'm
go ahead.
I'm I'm curious what you think about this, Mike. So, was it you and I? Maybe we were talking about this, but do you know the Pat Metheny Rick Beato interview?
Oh yeah, I've seen some of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um, so I love that interview.
Yeah.
I'm kind of embarrassed by how many times I've watched that
That's
and listened
good.
to it. Yeah.
You're absorbing it. Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I hope I'm
I need to
absorbing.
rewatch that. Yeah, I need to rewatch that too.
Well, I mean, I feel like Pat Metheny says so many wonderful, kind of perplexing things in the course of that interview, and a lot of enlightening things too. But one of the things that he says is something to the effect of like melody is the branch. It's the one member of the three branches of musical government, as he calls them. I guess
Interesting.
he's talking about melody, rhythm, and harmony.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, of course, there are other.
That's what I would, that's the most, yeah, straightforward, I think.
Yeah, um, but he says that that's the one branch that you can't go to school for 4 years on.
Mm.
Um, and I think he goes on to explain that a little bit, and I think what he means is that I think what he ultimately ends up meaning is that he doesn't really think it's possible to give like a full account of in the sense of a recipe, that if you just understand that recipe, um, you'll be able to write a great melody, or one that sort of hits home in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
Um, and I think part of what he means to suggest also there is that there is an element of like um, of sort of ineffable intuition that goes into crafting a great melody that maybe is just forever beyond the reach of
Oh, that's
kind of
interesting.
theoretical explanation. Um,
That would make
which,
sense because I feel like sometimes, yeah, just like mind boggled by some of the,
oh my gosh,
yeah,
yeah,
possibilities and yeah.
totally, and especially from him, like I
Yeah.
I don't think I would ever think of some of the, well, I know I would never think of like a lot of the things that Pat Metheny has thought of.
Me either. Yeah. Most
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
99.99% of people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Uh, but I do feel like I feel like that's an interesting, in one sense, kind of liberating thing to hear from somebody as great as Pat Metheny, because it's like, oh, yeah, well, I guess my issue is not that I'm missing out on the great recipe, but I think it also like kind of begs the next natural question, which is, well, even if a great melody is not really explained by all these funny, intricate theoretical things, but is instead explained by some sort of intuition on the part of the person who writes it. Um, how do you go about acquiring that kind of intuition, or how do you go about cultivating that kind of intuition? And I feel
Yeah.
like the more I think about that, or sort of bang my head against it, the more I feel like, well, the only real way of doing that occurs to me is to learn a lot of melodies, or to have like just an
Hmm.
overwhelming volume
That's what the
of
conclusion
examples.
sorry, not to interrupt. That's the conclusion
Oh
I
yeah,
came
yeah,
to as well.
yeah.
I went through a
Yeah.
phase where I'm like, I'm just going to learn like 100 melodies
There
and
you go.
just try to learn them and not even, I didn't analyze them or anything, but just learn how to play them and just got the basic. I mean, I guess like a small layer of analysis, but nothing like not
Yeah,
note by note type of thing. But
totally. Yeah, well, I feel like I'm curious what you feel about this. So my feeling is that like when you're taking that approach, um, kind of building a melodic sensibility or even a harmonic sensibility, um, just by like working through an incredible volume of like um, ideal examples or whatever. It's like the analytical frameworks that we have like from school and stuff, those less become a lot less of a way of explaining what's going on, and instead they just become tools for quickly remembering facts about those melodies so that they stick in your head with
mm,
another layer of glue, sort of conceptual glue,
yeah,
than just your knowledge of how they go, right? Like they can, if you remember, maybe not exactly the sound of something you heard 10 years ago, but you remember that it's a tonic triad and then a
hmm,
neighbor figure and then it goes to the dominant. Like that can be a way of sort of
quickly
quickly
recalling
decoding. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, decoding. Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah, for sure.
which I feel like the analytical stuff is so useful for that.
Yeah,
Um, but it somehow it feels that it feels to me like the frame is a little bit different from sort of doing a grammatical parsing,
yeah,
uh,
for sure.
sort of for its own sake, or as a means of explaining why something works especially well.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think I'm definitely guilty of overanalyzing things in music and trying to try to explain like why everything is I want everything to make sense. And so that's why sometimes I feel like I'll struggle with like romantic music or
Mm.
early uh modern music. I think that fascinates me because so much of it doesn't make total sense, you know? Um, whereas like if you study Mozart or Bach, it's like everything, if you analyze it, everything makes sense. It's very rare you're gonna find something but
Mm.
but yeah, like that type of music. Or different, there's a lot of different that's what I think is fascinating too, and why I think people keep coming back to music even after doing it for so long, is just trying to understand there's just still stuff that you can't fully explain, you don't fully understand. And
Sure.
but it's like great. A lot of times, some of the parts of music that I enjoy the most, if I try to view them through that analytical lens, I'll I can't figure them out. Like I'll go back, I'll be listening to a piece, I won't be thinking about analysis at all. I'll just be listening just for pleasure, or just to, um,
Yeah.
and then I'll be like, I really like this moment. What's happening in this moment? And I'll go back, and sometimes you can explain it, and sometimes it's like it's hard to explain exactly what's going on there, and maybe that's why it's so interesting. And that's kind of like what Pat Metheny, kind of similar to what he was saying. Um,
Totally. Yeah.
so yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like there's also an element of that that's interesting to me, even like with music that does on the surface seem to, just be unswerving in its, making crystal clear sense.
Yeah.
I feel like, you were just talking about Bach, and so recently I've been with my students who are working on sight reading.
Hmm.
Um, we've been I mean, we do other things than this, but as well. But one layer of what we do is that we'll just crack open a random page in the Well-Tempered Clavier,
Yeah.
and then the goal is definitely not to read, both, not to make an on-the-spot transcription of the whole texture,
Yeah.
um, or anything like that. But basically, we'll just take like one contrapuntal line, maybe confined to like a bar or maybe two at the most,
Hmm.
and then that's the sight reading exercise. And we do like a bunch of different things about where to find it on the fretboard, blah 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 blah. That's sort of beside the point. The point that I'm trying to make is that through that process, I guess I often feel like I find things in that music that like the harder I look at them, the less they make kind of really clear, logical seeming sense. The
Mm.
more sort of fantasy I feel like I find there, the
Yeah.
more the more sort of just weird situations I find there.
Okay,
Um,
interesting.
whereas I feel like, when I'm listening in kind of a passive way,
Hmm.
um, I think a lot of times what I'm hearing is just a like I'm taking in the notes and rhythms to some degree, but I think more often than not, what I'm taking in really is just the extent of like my understanding of the style at that moment, and sort of like my I think what's going on for me is I'm sort of grouping everything under the umbrella of whatever my understanding is of the style. So I'm hearing the style more
Mm,
than the music, if that makes
okay,
sense.
interesting.
Um, like and I'm in that context, like as we're listening by, if I hear some crazy chord, um, if it more or less fits with my understanding of the style, it doesn't necessarily register. I'm not mentally flagging that as something of special interest.
Hmm.
Whereas if I'm looking at it in isolation and I think like, wait a minute, that's a absolutely crazy town sound. Like
Yeah,
what is this seriously quote unquote Baroque music?
right. Like a
Or
major
whatever.
chord or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Like
something
then I feel,
wild.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
really
Yeah, just
exotic.
one exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But do you know what I mean though? It's like
yeah, for sure.
a lot of times like stuff can be weirder than you think. um
Yeah,
until you
that's
like sort of
interesting.
stop and look at it and appreciate how weird it is.
Yeah. I guess I haven't analyzed Bach in a long time too. So maybe, yeah, I need to go back and do that before I speak talk about that.
Hmm.
But like Mozart, I feel like a lot of Mozart's music's very like he does some of his stuff does kind of start leaning into romanticism, it feels like some of his
Hmm.
like the minor symphony like 40 and number 25. I
Hmm.
I feel like that not to get away from what we were just talking about,
Oh yeah.
um but it's kind of related, I think, is like because I play those for my students in the music appreciation class that I teach. We go through both of those symphonies,
Yeah.
and it's ironic because we're talking about classical music. I'm trying to expose them to classical music, and
Hmm.
that's like Mozart's like those are like the pinnacle of like Mozart's like the pinnacle of classical music, and then those are like the pinnacle of some of Mozart's work,
Hmm.
and and then they make sense. I'm trying to teach them about functional harmony and how every note has a place within the piece.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel like those pieces are very functional, but there's a lot of he's starting to get away from that. And there's some really interesting modulations, I think. I think I forget right now. Some of it's pretty typical because I think they're both in sonata form, the first movement, and then they modulate from the minor to the relative major. If I remember
Hmm.
correctly, it's been a while since I've um so some of it's pretty typical, um but yeah, it starts to lean towards romanticism, I think, a little bit,
Hmm.
and so it is unexpected, and yeah, it's interesting. Trying to think about
Yeah.
now I'm trying to think about that, and um but yeah, that's a great point. I think I'll have to go back and look at some Bach, some pieces by
Oh,
Bach,
sure.
and or like a great example maybe of that too is in the Toccata and Fugue, the famous, um, but da 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 da,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
one. I forget the number for that one. It's somewhere in the 500s.
Yeah. Mhm.
But the chord that's at the end of the introduction to that, the very last chord, it's like this like monster. It's like a diminished chord, like you hear diminish in there, but there's a lot of stuff in there. I don't
Yeah.
know if there's a specific name of that chord or if like anyone's analyzed that, they know the exact, but that's a really interesting chord that is
The God,
not, what you say?
the Godzilla chord, you mean?
Yeah, that's exact that one.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, I don't know if that one how that works exactly. It does resolve. There's a suspension resolves down to a major chord. So I guess that's
Yeah.
still functional, but yeah, that chord. Yeah, that's an interesting example, I think, of kind of what you're talking about. Um,
Totally. Totally.
but yeah,
Where it's like every available tension has been uh deployed in that moment.
yes, yes, every single one. Yeah, it
Uh-huh.
feels like anyway.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Uh, yeah, that's really interesting.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
I'm curious, Mike, like when because I feel like I remember your when you I don't know if it was when you started the like I'm gonna going to war, I'm gonna learn 100 tunes or whatever. But I remember this notebook that you had,
hmm.
that you were like I seem to remember you were keeping track of the
Oh yeah,
tunes.
I think I still have that actually.
Oh yeah?
It's blue, like light blue.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I found that pretty recently, and I forgot that I did that actually. That's how long ago? That was like 5 years ago, or maybe or so.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I remember, well, not just then, but now I found that really inspiring and cool.
Oh, thanks, man. I mean, it's I make stuff like that all the time, and then because I'm trying to keep track of. I'm a very disorganized person, so I try have to write stuff down to kind of keep track of what I'm working on, or it
Totally.
just becomes chaos.
Mm.
Um, and so I'm working. So I always make lists, but then I end up making way too many lists sometimes. But I think at that point, sometimes though, it's really working for me. Like sometimes I'll go through phases where that's really effective in helping me learn and stay focused towards a goal or something like that. And
Mm.
then I'll go through phases where I feel like that's not working at all, and I have to take a different approach. Um, but yeah, I still have that. I was looking through that recently to look at all the list of tunes in there too. And it's interesting because when I was first trying to learn tunes, I was like on a goal, like a mission to just learn as many like jazz standards as I could. Uh, I wrote down this long list of all these tunes. I was like, I know this, I can play, you know. And I remember showing it to a really great jazz pianist too. And he looked at me, he's like, you know all these? And I was like, yeah. And then I looked at it now of like 5 years later, and I'm like, I could not. I mean, I knew that like I knew the melody and the chords
Uh-huh.
reasonably well, but a lot of them I didn't even know the melody well enough, you know. So
Uh-huh.
I've had to go back over them,
Oh man.
you know, with a lot of those. But that's what's interesting too. And this I've been talking to my students now that I'm in my 30s, not um, you know, it's a little, you know, I don't want to say I'm older because a lot of older musicians are gonna be like, what are you talking about? You know, but but I'm not in my early 20s anymore. I remember feeling like in my early 20s, I had to have everything figured out in terms
Mm.
of, you know, like learning pieces. I look at learning pieces way different now than I did in my early 20s
Mm.
because
Do
I
tell.
because of yeah, I'm curious what you think about this too, Eli, because now I view it more as like it's just an ongoing thing. Like if you're trying to learn a new piece of music, whatever it is, it could even be a pop song or a rock song or jazz, classical, whatever it is that you're working on. It's just like an ongoing process that is kind of never ending. Whereas I think in my 20s, early 20s, I felt like all this pressure to be like, I have to master this piece right now, or I'm never going to, or what, you know, you just
Yeah.
don't, I just didn't have the perception of time to be like, oh, I have 10, like when I was 21, now I'm 31, and I'm like, oh, I had 10 years to learn that piece, you know, kind of mindset. Because if I played it now, learned it now, I would be able to learn it better than when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah.
So a lot of my students, I kind of tell them that if especially if they're getting discouraged on something, I'll just tell them, let's just work on something else and come back to it. Because if, you know, I'll tell them like, if you're 21, you know, and you can't play this, it's not a big deal, you know. You have
Yeah.
if you keep playing the rest of your life, it doesn't really it's not gonna matter that much when
Mm.
you're 35. You're gonna be like, that's so easy, and then I was stressing over for no reason, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious how you feel about that, Eli, because I feel like now a lot of the purpose of like the things I learned when I was younger is like serves as almost just like a foundation for where I'm at now. And I can go back and relearn those pieces and learn them, like you're saying, like get that depth. Almost feel like you have to spend on something that's really difficult, that's really kind of pushing you to like your edge of what you're capable of doing. I
Mhm.
feel like you have to spend, I mean, there's a lot of different answers to this. I don't think there's any correct answer, but for me, what I found is like if I spend like a year or two really trying to get inside that music and really try to um, just try as hard as I can to master it, then putting it down for a while and maybe returning to it in a couple years, then I feel like I can kind of get to that next level that maybe I wasn't able to, or like there's certain pieces that I did kind of like the Bach, JS Bach 1006 Prelude. I played that when I was 23 or so.
Oh wow.
Um, and I remember that piece. I was able to play it and I performed it, and maybe 50 to 70% of the time, maybe I played it pretty well. I was like proud of it. And then there was like a 30 to, percent of the time where I was like, it just fell apart. And it's like now I'm thinking about, well, now you have such a great foundation on that piece. If you went back to relearn it, now would be a better time to kind of play it and have it ingrained. So I'm curious what you think about that. This concept of like coming back to things, or what's the process of mastery for something look like for you?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think yeah. Well, actually there are a bunch of things in what you just said, Mike, that I feel like are really worth thinking about. A lot of wisdom there. I feel like um so I really resonate with one of the main things you just said, which was that the process of learning music now is very different from how it was for me 10 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's partly to do with maybe maturity of a certain kind, or like maybe just sort of available resources of a certain kind, available like physical resources in the way that my hands work,
Hmm.
and available sort of musical or mental resources in the way that the way that I think, or the way that I know how to practice, or blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
That makes it different. I also think that I really resonate with what you were saying about like um, what it is that you want learning music to do now versus what its sort of function was like
Mhm.
in your life 10 years ago. And I feel
Yeah.
like when I think about it like that, it's not really a mystery to me um why in the early 20s, when a lot of us are like in or are like approaching this kind of music, like classical guitar music, in an academic context. um, Academic contexts are really good at like at helping you think in um,
Exact.
months. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say exact. Never mind. I think you're going a different direction, but that's
Oh
all right.
yeah, well, I was thinking like they're really good at helping you think in like in unit-sized pieces that add up to maybe 4 years at a stretch,
Mm.
right? Like
Yeah.
a semester turns into two semester. It's like the arithmetic makes a lot of sense. Like the
Hmm.
mental arithmetic makes a lot of sense, and there are really clear signposts along the way within the context of like a degree or whatever, that on the one hand help you structure your time in a really helpful way. I think like the academic music stuff would be impoverished in terms of what it was offering to its students if it didn't have that kind of built-in
No, for
structure.
sure.
But I think it also, I mean, I think to a certain degree, that kind of structure is a helpful illusion, right? Like
Mm.
there is no um, thing outside of the self-contained context of school that means that you need to give a recital of this length in
Yeah.
exactly 3 years' time,
Right.
um, uh, and covering these stylistic periods, or blah 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 blah.
Hmm.
Um, so I feel like in your early 20s, especially if you find yourself in that kind of context, which like we both did.
Right.
um, I feel like it's not a mystery at all as to like why the hunger for the most sort of ambitious thing that can be accomplished
Yeah.
in that ultimately kind of artificial seeming um,
Time frame.
time frame. Why that would be a major motivation, and why all of our musical energies would be bent on making things happen in that context. Like, whereas now I feel like, removed from the study side of the academic context, like, what we use learning music for, is really different. And, I think for me, what I use learning music for right now is, attending to my professional obligations. If I have to play, if I get to play a concert, then, the natural question for me is like, okay, well, what's the music that's going to suit this thing that
Hmm.
I get to
Oh
play.
yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and that's a very, very different question from what's the hardest thing I can make my fingers do in 3 years. Um,
Yes.
and it also, I think, takes a kind of reframing that's more mature than, how can I be always operating at like the upper limit of like
Yeah.
my
Absolute
capabilities at
peak.
this point? Exactly. Because
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of times, what you can do at your absolute peak for a 50-minute recital is not the most responsible thing to do, when you're representing yourself professionally, right? Like
Hmm.
it really doesn't matter. What matters is that you have great artistically compelling command over, whatever it is that you're offering,
Hmm.
on that occasion. And so then it seems to me like the question is, well, how can you, like, especially when you're being paid for your services, like how can you guarantee for yourself and for whoever it is that's paying you that you're going to be able to deliver something that is worth, paying for? And probably the answer is not like doing the thing that you're 50% sure is going to work. um,
Yeah.
I mean, like, I don't mean to say that there isn't any room for experimentation or anything like that,
Right.
but like, but I do feel like there's a difference there, that comes with having different kinds of obligations. And I guess so. I also feel like, thinking about what you're learning, or what I'm learning, fits into the things that I do professionally. I feel like that's one side of it. Another side of it is like, um, I find myself a lot more motivated to, kind of spend longer, in the ideas,
Mm.
kind of behind a piece of music. So I feel like my first question for myself, like learning music in undergrad and even in like the masters and stuff, was, um, okay, how am I going to conquer the challenges that this piece presents,
Hmm.
or this recital presents, or whatever?
Yeah.
And, now I feel like my that was an intensely motivating question to me then. And now I feel like the motivating question to me is, what does this music feel like? Like, what is it that I find so compelling about this that I'm willing to spend like, probably, years
Yeah.
maturing with it, or having it, in my mental furniture? What do I find so, gets its like hooks in me, that I'm willing to spend that kind of time with it and want to spend that kind of time with it? And also, like, uh, how much can I sort of discover about this piece that is going to surprise me? And, that feels to me like a much more patient, much more ultimately rewarding process for where I am now. Um,
Hmm.
but it strikes me as very different from like the mindset of, um, that at least I certainly had, as like,
Yeah.
during my education.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, I guess I think like, uh, it's funny. I've been thinking about this. So, parent non sequitur, but like, my wife and I have been playing a lot of, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild
Oh, it's a
in the
good game. Yeah.
it's amazing. And,
Yeah.
and I feel like
That's
there's,
fun to play with your wife. I think that'd be a great experience.
oh, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's awesome. But I feel like one of the great things about that game is that like, it kind of, sums up in this very poetic kind of silly way, like the interior struggle of like a music student, right? Like, on the one hand, you can accomplish the main quest. You can like
Right.
be a speed runner, and you can it's like the equivalent of just like bolting down your food. And there is something sort of nice about it, I guess. Like it's colors on the screen and it's very exciting and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But then there's that's completely different from like a slow walk through the environment where you notice lots of stuff and um, the joy of playing it, the game is in the very act of like noticing every little nook and cranny
Yeah.
and sort of just being in the atmosphere that it creates.
Yeah.
Uh, so I feel like that's a very there's a parallel there with like how I feel that my approach to learning music and what I value in it has changed. I don't know. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, that's no, that's really interesting. I think I read somewhere that the creators of Breath of the Wild, they intended it for music students for that exact no, just that,
I would believe it.
yeah, that's an
Yeah.
interesting parallel. Yeah, because if you're playing a game like that's a pretty intense RPG. So you're
Yeah.
like you're inhabiting that world and that atmosphere, like you're saying, and that's kind of similar to learning a piece that's like very you're kind of inhabiting that same atmosphere or that you're trying to get like we are talking about earlier, you're trying to get in the mindset of the composer, trying to get in the world that they're trying to create.
Totally.
And yeah, and so like with if you're in Rodrigo's world, for instance, you're gonna have a lot of clashing minor seconds, and they're gonna be, they're gonna be all over the place, and just have to
Yeah.
be ready for them.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting.
Yeah. What's that like? Is that like from Shrek or whatever, where Lord Farquaad's like, "Some of you may die, but it's a." I feel like that's Rodrigo's world.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, I've died in that world plenty of
Yeah.
times. Uh,
Yeah,
that's a tough one, man. Um,
for sure.
I remember one time I did like week long like summer camp like classical guitar camps when I was younger at
Oh,
Cincinnati, University of Cincinnati.
that's cool.
And yeah, it was a really fun experience. But I got to meet this guy, Carlos Perez. Have you ever heard of, I'm not sure if you've
I
he's
don't know that name.
I believe he's South American, a great, really amazing virtuosic classical guitarist. And he's known, I think, for playing Rodrigo. And I think I was like 19 or 20 at the time, and he was asking me if I played any Rodrigo, and I was like, no. And he was very nice, but now I think back on it, it's like he's trying to see like how he's like, how good are you good or not? Like, can you play? Not that you have to play Rodrigo to be good at classical guitar, but that's like
Yeah.
playing. That's some of the hardest. I feel like for me anyway, that's some of the hardest music I feel like I played is Rodrigo for sure. It's like
Hmm.
he's up there with Bach. Sometimes even just in terms of the discomfort of the left hand, I feel like is
Hmm.
like some of that's so challenging.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
but
But
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I feel
yeah.
like the I totally agree. Like the physical actually, so ironically, the only Rodrigo that I've played is Aranjuez.
No, okay.
Uh and
That's
I
I
feel
mean
like
that's piece is really hard too.
oh my gosh,
Obviously,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, totally.
yeah.
And I kind of feel like it's the level of difficulty is such that at least for me,
You just shouldn't play it.
what's that?
You just shouldn't play it. No, just
Yeah. Yeah, just right in the recycling bin. Um,
it's a tough, yeah, it's not piece. I played that too. It was very, I remember it being very challenging.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's the degree of challenge is to such a degree that you kind of have to end up with just your own version of it. And like
Mm.
whatever way you make peace with the challenges and sort of negotiate them. Yeah,
Yeah.
if that means, leaving out some notes, which is certainly the tack that I took, um,
Yeah.
among other things, like I feel like the 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 challenges invite, you know,
Some
Very,
creativity.
very, yeah, very personal solutions.
Yeah, that's interesting. That ties into at the same workshop. Stanley Yates was there,
Mm,
and he's a really great arranger. And I remember he was giving a master class. This is still when I was like 19 or 20 or so, and he was talking about some Baroque piece that someone there was like a chord in there that someone couldn't play, and one of the notes was doubled in the chord. So he said, I would just take it out, like as
yeah.
simple as that. And I remember at the time thinking, I was like, what are you crazy? It's like
Uh-huh.
you can't change the notes of the composer, you know? And
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
just thought that way for like years after that. And but I kept thinking about it because now I'm 31, I'm over 10 years later. And
Yeah.
now I'm like, oh, of course you should take that note out. It's like no one's going to be able to tell, especially sometimes it's debatable, but it's like especially a doubled note. It's like
Right.
if it's messing up the whole piece, then
Yeah.
you need almost need to take it out.
Yeah.
Um,
Totally.
so that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's
But
interesting.
totally. But I feel like what's funny is like the uh it's an interesting thought experiment, I think. Like, okay, so suppose that that player had learned the piece they were playing by ear,
Hmm.
and maybe the doubled note would have been in there, but it's, I don't know, probably a 50-50 proposition whether or not, learning by ear, as you say, maybe nobody would notice. Probably a
Right.
50-50 proposition whether if you're learning by ear, that you would realize that that doubled note was in there, or, buried in the middle of the voicing, or
Hmm.
not. And my guess is that learning by ear, you would have like that player would have had an entirely different relationship, or a different sense of obligation, let's say, like, to that note buried somewhere in the middle of the chord. Whereas the sense of obligation that governs our decisions so many times, like when we're dealing with a notated score, is completely different. Where there's a um, there is a strong like knee-jerk reaction against deleting any little blot of ink that we find on the page.
Hmm.
Um, but that seems to me to be so like medium specific. Like it's like we don't have that. We don't bring that same other kinds of learning, or really even our own listening. I feel like scores are interesting, weird animals that like that kind
Hmm.
of that put us in weird frames of mind like that, where we might be willing to sacrifice, the flow of an entire passage for the sake of respecting one note because we
Hmm.
find it written there. It's like the
Yeah.
written medium is weird.
It is, yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of things that makes me think of. I think for me, I was coming from the perspective, I remember when I was young, I was, yeah, in that mindset of like being very literal, like we were talking about. But also I remember I was working on, I think a piece by like Scarlatti or something like that. And there were some notes I think that one of my professors told me to take out when I was younger. And I felt like that was an important note, and it wasn't like a double note. And they said just take it out or something. And I remember being like really disappointed because I love that. I love that, you know? So
Mm,
it's like there's instances where I think it makes sense. And then that, there's some instances where I think, I mean, yeah, it's hard to know, I guess, where the line is for that stuff.
mm,
Um, but going back to the score, like talking about the score being weird. I took a class talking about that, like that was like a unit in the class specifically, was just like what is a score? What does that mean? Like what is
mm.
it was Phil Ford's class, so I don't know. Do you know Phil
Oh,
Ford?
I know of him. I never did get to take a course of his, but I that's a regret.
Oh yeah. He was a really I loved the way he thought. Like he's a really interesting thinker to me.
Mm,
And just like he just questioned a lot of um he just would question a lot of things I felt like people just kind of took for granted and one of them was like talking about a musical score, and we looked at we looked at different scores, like modern scores, by people like Lamont Young and who are some of the other ones like Terry Riley, and they kind of challenged, and a bunch of other ones too, that challenged like what a score was and like how you should interpret
hmm
a score, and trying to challenge like this like composer as the end all be like what the composer says is like the end all be all in terms of how to play something. I remember that being a really interesting class as well. Um, but
Totally.
uh, but yeah, it makes you kind of think. And then I mean we're talking about like a very minute. That's challenging, like a much larger. We're talking about more minute things, but you can take it into that, I think, and kind of use that in different ways, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That actually reminds me of something I wanted to ask you about, Mike, which was that I feel like I've been in conversations with people recently where they ask me some version of the question, do you improvise or are you an improviser?
Yeah.
And on the one hand, my strong inclination, given what I think I understand implicitly about the question that they're asking, is to say no. Most of the time, when I'm like 90% of the time at least, um, when I'm playing music, I'm not improvising.
Hmm.
Um, just given the kind of thing that I am doing most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, but that has struck me as a less and less satisfying answer recently. Um, and I find myself much more tempted now to sort of respond with a question, um, or maybe with an edited question, which is like, what do you improvise, if anything?
Mm.
Because I feel like, a player who um, has, much the same sort of academic background that, that we do, who's sort of in, the classical guitar scene, um, most of the time is dealing with notated out scores
Hmm.
that by and large don't make any sort of effort to question what the medium of a score is.
Hmm.
They're fairly straightforward looking things
Right.
that tell us, the notes and rhythms that we're supposed to play. But those very same scores, of course, are either totally silent on some musical issues, or um, if they're not totally silent, they are somewhat vague about like ideas about dynamic or about
Hmm.
articulation or about timbre.
Yeah.
Um, they're and so I mean, it does make me think. Well, I'm certain that the same player would not play exactly the same sequence of decibels and the same spectral profile of a thing every time they play it. So and they're not sort of programming all of that information in.
Hmm.
um so part of me thinks like, well, even the most conservative um sort of classical guitarist must be improvising some parameters of the music most of
Hmm.
the time. um and the any mistakes that happen which happen to all of us, those weren't planned, they aren't specified in the score. It's hard to see immediately how they would be conceptually different from an improvisation and you know uh, as we normally construe it. So I guess I feel like, do you experience that same tension as to thinking about like what it is, what element of music you're improvising in a given moment? Like, do you think about improvisation in that kind of, I don't know, more expansive way than only thinking about the pitches and rhythms that you happen to be playing, or what's your? Let me ask you the question, Mike. Do you improvise?
Yeah, I feel like everybody improvise, Um, it feels like to me, when you're living your life, I mean, you have to improvise. You can't plan out every single, it depends on what you're like. It becomes like a definitional kind of problem almost.
Yeah.
What do you define as improvisation? So to me, improvisation is just anything that's unplanned, basically.
Mm.
Well, I'll just say that, even though we could argue for, people could argue forever on what improvisation is, and I'm not like an expert on that by any stretch, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and we talked about it in that class too. There was a section on improvisation, talking about exactly what you're talking about, Eli, and we talked about that, and yeah, I think you could make the case that even if you're playing a quarter note and you play a quarter note C, but you play it even just a hair too long, you just improvised, you know? You could make, if you want to make it like like that, you know, strict definition like that, you know. And so then if we can consider that, if we can agree that that's improvising, which some people might say that's not, that's, you know, that's ridiculous level of, you know, but if we can agree to some extent that that's improvisation, then it's like the answer is like, of course we're always you know. So I kind of agree with that, because like you said, it's, even if you tried to play the same piece with everything you had in you, you tried to play the same piece the same way, even just 2 times exactly the same, I don't think anyone could do it. Maybe, but yes. So then it just becomes a question of like, what level are you, or to what extent are you improvising at? So, yeah, so you can improvise with all kinds of like dynamics. Everybody, I think, improvises with dynamics. I don't know.
Yeah.
You can have a written out plan, but you're still not gonna. Are you gonna have the same fortissimo every single time at the exact same point in the piece? You know. So
surely.
And do you want that? Because too, a lot of times for me is, if I have such a strict plan and I go into a performance being like, I have to follow this plan to the T and I can't deviate it from it at all, those are a lot of times my worst performances. And even if I get all the notes right and all the rhythms right, there's just this sense of like robotic, you know, it's not coming from a place of like, there's no emotion involved. It takes a lot of the emotion out, I think. To an extent, people can disagree too. I'm not saying this is right, but this is how I think of it. And
no, I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think people are improvising constantly, and then it's more to me like a question to what extent, I guess. But yeah, what do you think?
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.